Hi, and welcome to the DevOps Online Summit, the DevSecOps track. I'm here today with Gunjan Syal, where we're going to be talking about scaling DevOps in an enterprise, more specifically about how the people, process, and tech alignment all fits together. I think we've got a really good chat for you. It's going to be in the interview format, so we're going to be going back and forth, and we've got a real expert here with us in Gunjan. She enables the high return on investment innovation transformation initiatives for strategy, governance, and planning from the Canadian sector as well as from the global sector, but based out of Toronto. Innovation initiatives are 26 US and Canadian businesses in 9 industries. She's also developed her own innovation framework, which some of it we'll get a chance to see today. Globally celebrated as a TED Circles host, and also serves on the Harvard Business Review Advisory Council. So getting a chance to read and see a lot of the real cutting edge aspects that are going forward. It also says you've got 15 years in consulting at IBM and Accenture, seeing technology, retail, finance services, healthcare, consulting, transportation, all those great kind of things you do, as well as public sector. She's founded efforts to transform platforms, and her experience is going to bring us that holistic perspective. So I'm really excited to jump into this. Gunjan, we'll let you kick us off.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Mark. And let me say how excited I am to be here. Over the last couple of years, we've seen that DevOps is really the bones, if you will, of transformation, right? If you can't enable CI/CD in your organization, you can't enable digital transformation. And that's what we'll dive into a little bit of that today. So I'll go ahead and share my screen.
Absolutely.
You should be able to see it now.
Yeah.
Perfect. So we've already seen my intro.
Yeah.
So approaching scale, it's an interesting conversation from a DevOps perspective, right? A lot of the times I find when the conversation first gets started around DevOps or DevSecOps in an organization, first of all, security is the last one to the table, right? DevOps conversations sort of start off from the application point of view, from cloud point of view. So as soon as security comes to the table, the tools conversation takes over. A lot of overwhelming conversations pop up. But oftentimes what I find is that the business teams are not always at the table. So when you're choosing the use case.
And I was going to say, you can really see that security being in their own bubble off there at the top of that arrow there, right? You've kind of got them, they're not in the loop with everybody else.
Absolutely. So let me actually go to the next slide a little bit, which is where you start to appreciate, and I did that on purpose. Security being in a bubble by themselves over on the side is that very traditional view. But this one is the one that I actually like to use with my clients, because you can see security is really ingrained into certain aspects of this. So you can see them out here, security champs. They start to come into the create and the verify state there. They play a big role there. You also see security coming up here in monitoring and analytics space, API, gateway, and security. So this is a very specific chart, but you can see security almost everywhere represented.
Sure. Well, I wasn't trying to derail you. You're just as a security guy myself, sometimes it's nice to say that we're in our own little bubble.
Absolutely. So let me just go back here for a second. But you and I were having this conversation offline earlier, Mark. How do you choose the right pilot? How do you choose the right use case? And that's truly the conversation, right? Oftentimes, it's the CIO organization and companies that's sponsoring DevOps or DevSecOps conversations, right? And nothing wrong with that. But oftentimes business gets left out of that table. So what we need truly, in my opinion, if you think about capabilities and the representation from a business perspective, we really do need to look at what are the use cases that will add value from an ROI perspective, right? Because DevOps pilot, it will set the stage for the longer conversation.
Well, it's nothing without value, right? You've got to have value before you can have DevOps.
Exactly. So what would be the right use case from a customer perspective, from a business point of view, from a technology tools and operations perspective, and security perspective as well, right? So in the remote world, we've seen the security conversation really take a leap, right? Cybersecurity, even if you look at the startup world, how many venture capital firms are making investments in the security firms these days? It's just skyrocketed.
Well, you have to have security. And I think one of the things we get too is you can't really have value without security nowadays. You can't, whether you count it as separate or you count it as an integral part, you've got to be able to make that. So what do you think is a good use case for somebody starting off their pilot? What have you seen in your?
Yeah, so I mean, let's take an example of a retail firm, right? So one of the things that could be, you start to section the company. Let's take it from that perspective. So there's the store conversations, then there are the e-commerce conversations. Then at the same time, there could be some other conversations around the warehouse operations. There could be other conversations from a perspective of your supply chain, right? So first step would be, what is the focus of the organization today? Because as soon as you understand that, you know that there's more eyes, more investment going into that part of the organization. So where I've seen a lot of those conversations shifting are from, let's say, retail, store type of operations towards e-commerce, right? So then shifting that from that to supply chain conversations. So looking at the supply chain piece, there's a lot of use cases that you could pick up because there's transformations happening. There are, I think I lost my chain of thought.
It
Sorry about
follows the
that.
arrow, though, right? Well,
Yeah.
we'll interject. We'll give you some time. We'll tell you stories along the way, right? So, good back and
You
forth.
can just cut this part out, right?
Yeah, well, it's different than the normal virtual. You say pivot, and I used to have a conversation with a friend of mine. We used to say, pivoting is great when you're ice skating and you get a really high score, but not
Right.
so good when you're just trying to mow the lawn. When you're trying to get the basics done, you don't want to have a whole lot of pivots because you wind up with a whole lot of uncut grass.
That's true. It's
Um,
very true.
so you talk about pivoting and finding your focus. Do you find a lot of these companies, even when they start a pilot, really don't have a good, clear focus, that they kind of want to do
Mhm.
everything all at once?
Yeah, and I think again, it depends on how the conversation, to be honest, got started within the organization and who the sponsor is and what's their focus. So oftentimes, because those even the strategic projects are happening very much in the silo type of way in that organization, and that's where I go back to the agile practices as well, right? Depends on where your organization is in that agile maturity mindset. So if there are certain parts of the organization that are further ahead than the others, especially in the remote world, you're going to invariably leave certain people off the table when you're talking about DevSecOps, right? So people that are not prepared to participate in those agile stand-ups and those type of conversations, they will not be ready with that mindset. So one of the things is to have that baseline.
So is that an inclusive? Is that more on the people that are starting the project, or is it? I mean, you do this for a living. You're a consultant. You bring people into these. How do you get people into the mindset
Hmm.
where they need to be?
So the first step would be from a use case perspective, and I wish now I'd put that chart on this slide. I actually have a chart that shows different perspectives to consider when you're first looking at a use case. So I basically, even if I don't put that chart in front of my customers, I like to go around the table, basically within the organization, and look at who are the touch points for that particular process. Who are the people that are upstream to that use case, downstream? Who are some of the partners or vendors that add value to that, and make sure that their point of view is represented in one shape or form, right? So that could be that they're consulting on this particular initiative, or they're just simply informed because there's a downstream change coming their way. Or it could be that there's changes that they need to make on their side of the house to even support this use case to be successful. Because just tools by themselves changing something, that's not really the ROI for organization, right? That's a very much of a cost center conversation.
We don't want more cost.
No. Well, plus at the same time, if it's just cost savings, then you're leaving things on the table, right? You're not really having that holistic conversation. So that's where the third bullet, if you see under pilot, it's a little bit of a catch-22, right? So yes, you're starting with the small teams because you want the psychological safety. You want the teams to feel safe when they're making those decisions where they're not sure if this would be a pass or a fail. You want them to be able to openly come to the table in that small group and make decisions. But at the same time, you want them to be aware of what the impact to other teams is going to be and go back and invite those perspectives in and have that conversation.
So since we're on the DevSecOps track, do you get enough security representation in those small teams? Do you feel?
Not always, to be honest. And partially, it's again the mindset that the security teams themselves might have, right? Because oftentimes they're very used to asking very certain type of questions, like a checklist almost. Well, do you have answers to these questions? Yes or no? Well, that may not always be the case. Maybe you need to come in and inform that. And other times, people may be afraid to bring security in because they're expecting them to come in and ask really tough questions that they may not be willing to answer or be able to answer at this point. So again, that goes back to the culture of failing fast, failing often, understanding that maybe we need to create a safe environment to try and test this out with some representative users or change agents, right? Not to start putting this out for public to use just yet. I don't think any organization will do that. They'll always find a use case that's easier to test in-house somehow first, because your employees in most cases may be the customers as well. And then the support from the leadership there really goes a long way, right? Because speaking of the culture, security teams themselves have had a subculture before. So what type of mindset would enable that change?
I don't believe it. Not at all.
No,
No,
it's
never,
it's
never.
funny.
No more than the
Last year,
developers or the operations people had a
no, and this
separate
problem goes
culture.
all the way up to companies that create these products, right? Last year, I had a conversation with somebody from Microsoft in Redmond, and they even admitted that even their teams sometimes have this problem, right? When they're developing products, security may come in and into the room, and the conversation feels like it changes a little bit. Well, why is that? Right? It's because there's this fear of security people will come and put a roadblock ahead, or maybe will propose some additional requirements that will change the timeline of your initiative or increase complexity in it. Right? So security really does need to be ingrained into every single thing, every conversation that happens with DevSecOps.
So as we're listening, I hear that. I kind of hear the problem up front, or it sounds like, and you can, offer your own opinion. He says, well, security comes into the room and then things change.
Right.
And that if you don't have security in the room when you started, then you're just as far behind, right?
Yeah, and I go back to that phrase, fail fast, fail often, right? Do you want to have the failure happen after you've gone live? Or do you want to have that happen ahead of the time and have someone in the room who's showing those risks to you before they become issues from a security point of view, right? So it's really about that. I don't think anybody likes to hear people come in and say, if you don't do this, this could happen, right? People don't like to be told that, but it's better to learn from somebody else's experience than your own, right? So it's one of
For
those
sure.
things, that's where culture comes in. So during the pilot phase, again, there's a bit of something to keep in mind, even if you have involved security teams, is that you may not be looking at all the different deployment use cases, right? So you're testing this in a protected environment, right? When
Mm-hmm.
you start to expand on that, that's when you start to build even more alignment, right? So even more alignment from business and technology teams. And I probably should have included security in there just to make that point even more explicit, right? Because you would have involved certain types of security teams, certain capabilities that are more hands-on in the pilot space. But as you expand and you look at things from a more enterprise-wide point of view, your use case itself starts to expand, right? So the customers start to get involved. If it's an e-commerce case as an example, and now you're starting to take this part of the solution that you develop and plug it into a bigger solution, you're inviting more data, you're inviting more perspectives. So that's where stakeholder representation, the goals, the use cases, the tool set, everything starts to really, really expand. And that's where you see that initial, that agile, right? Like I've got 7 core people in my team. You have to change that mindset and go, well, now I'm looking at this with an enterprise wide. So certain people need to come and go from my core team at certain parts of this conversation.
So again, do you find that happens as teams try to scale, right? Because once you have one success, you want to put it out there. Do you
Right.
find they try to scale? Is it a gradual process, or can you go from a small team to 100 teams? Or
Yeah, so this is where leadership really plays a very important role, right? You need to set the right expectations with people. And again, that's where fail fast, fail often comes in. So we need certain boundaries from the leadership to say, this is what we consider success. This is what we consider a failure. I don't think you can technically go from 10 to 100 in one shot. That would be very risky for me. Again, depends on the use case, depends on the organization, but maybe at least go from 10 to a 40, 40 to an 80, and then to 100, because then that psychological safety can continue and build upon itself. Because as people are more successful, their confidence rises, then they can share that confidence with others, and it gives them a chance to train others on the team based on what they have learned as well.
doesn't it depend on whether you want scaled development or scaled production?
It's very true. Very true.
Because if you develop something and then you want to distribute it, they just have to know how to operate it on a wider
Right.
basis, right?
That's very true, actually. So again, depends how you define scale to your point in that organization, right? If it's something that's replicable very easily, then yeah, once you've developed it, you can just go ahead and do that, right? But then again, I was having actually an interesting conversation with one of the clients this morning, moving from a project type mindset to a product type mindset, right? So that's the other thing that you can bring in, even at the pilot phase, right? If you tell people that you're developing a product, then they understand that this product has to live and breathe. And they start to think in terms of what will be my role when this product grows up, right? When it's in production, would I be the one supporting it? Would it be another team that's supporting it? When you talk about projects, they have a start and end. So it's like how do I get to the finish for my job? Right? It's that type of mindset because at some point I will finish this and that would be the end of it. So then I need to march as fast as possible and just get it done.
I'm thinking about that, and I'm thinking about it from that MVP perspective. And
Mm-hmm.
what do you want? And that it is both from security is both a product and a project. That
Right.
I have a set time to develop a product, but I need that product delivered in those fail fast stages.
Right. However, I would argue actually, even when you're developing an MVP, because you're doing it, let's say, in a product like manner, there is a product roadmap behind it, right? So MVP is a select set of features that you've chosen and you've decided to do them first. So during that process of building that MVP, if you're agile, you may find some additional information that may require you to go back and renegotiate that MVP definition, right? Because there's something bigger behind it. That doesn't always
Cost.
happen in projects unless you're running at waterfallish, right? Because now you've got clearly laid out phases. So in that way, I find that it actually is a nice bridge for an organization that may have been waterfallish. And I say ish because sometimes it's a mishmash of agile-ish, waterfallish, whatever you want to call it. But having that product roadmap, at least at the high level, and choosing certain set features to create that MVP, as you mentioned, and giving it a time box, it gives the team that mentality of, yes, I've got X amount of time to finish it, but now I can go back and negotiate if I find some additional information that changes that. And this goes beyond DevSecOps, really, right? You could apply to any digital transformation, really.
And I think some of that what we're talking about, and like you mentioned, we had some earlier chats, goes
Mhm.
into that scaled agile framework kind of setup, right?
Right.
Where you have an architectural roadmap that you can deliver a smaller MVP feature as part
Yeah.
of the overall product, even though you have a timeline for how long you're going to do things.
Exactly. And that's where the releases and the different roles and the mindset comes into play, right? So scaled agile actually has trainings that people can go through at various levels to understand how to manage those expectations. And that's the part of it, right? It's not really a set of framework that you use like a Bible. The art of the possible truly is how do you manage expectations around the table to make it work? Because you can't have people thinking, this is my release. I have 1 year to do it and that's it. It's not a regulatory project, right?
Well, I worked with a federal company, and
Oh,
you
there
get
you go.
option years, and you get certain years, and they use safe formats, but they get we're going to do a release every quarter, regardless
Right.
of everything else. And any features
Exactly.
we get done by that time, that at that MVP level, we're going to push out to the user at that point and move forward from there. So
Right.
it's
And then
kind of
there's
that you have both
goals.
a product and a project, right? That you have a time frame for a project, but you still have it we call it
Yeah.
snapping the chalk line if you're building a house or
Actually,
doing.
that's interesting you say that. You use the word project, but I would almost call it a product approach, right? It's similar to, let's call it like that Amazon approach, right? If I'm going to do a release daily, then I'm going to do a release daily, right?
Right.
Whether there's 2 features in it or 10, that's really up to the team, right? How much
Mm-hmm.
can you get done? And that may change if my user finds an issue that's going to impact my Prime Day tomorrow. And that's the same thing for government, right? Like these days, if you think about in Canada, for us, tax season's coming up. And unfortunately, CRA has been dealing with certain security issues, right? Speaking of which. So from that point of view, they're really under the gun to unlock those thousands, hundreds of thousands, by the way, of accounts they're facing these issues. They've had to be locked down to protect them from security threats. And we don't really know out in the market what that truly means. But somebody at CRA is monitoring this and trying to, first of all, identify the level of threat and then figure out how to make this happen. So if you don't have a CI/CD pipeline, I don't know how you make sure when you're layering those fixes on top of one another, how that's supposed to work, right?
Well, and let's be honest, it's not always the security part that fails.
Agreed. Absolutely,
No,
right?
no matter how good your tests are, sometimes there's
Yeah.
another part of it that
Yeah, it could be your data
has issues in
architecture.
production, right?
Oh, absolutely. It all starts with the architecture piece, though, right? Like I have that enterprise architecture background, and I've seen firsthand. I'll tell you a funny story. I won't say which client. When I was working at Accenture, we did a pilot for this large retailer, and Christmas time, stores were shut down because scale was not considered. So we developed this perfect solution, deployed it. But a perfect solution is only perfect if you can scale it, right?
Yeah.
And that's where it failed. You give it the 100,000 transaction, it just blows up.
But with security, we say our perfect security use case is the container that nobody uses, right? If nobody uses it, if we have no users, then we have no security issues ever. It's not connected. It sits in the middle of the room.
Yeah,
It doesn't do anything, but it's
absolutely.
100% secure. So we're
Yep.
aligning. We moved from our pilot to our alignment. Now governance, right? As we're talking about security and how we get everybody back in line with scale.
Yeah. So we actually sort of touched upon this already when we were talking about the need for strong leadership. The iterative piece, we kind of covered that as well when you were talking about releases as an example, right? So how are you ensuring that with each iterative release, first of all, you have to reduce the timeline between releases, right? But at the same time, you also have to ensure CI/CD, right? So if you're building features on top of one another, how are you ensuring that? And that's where QA automation and those type of conversations come in, right? You need to ensure that there's a certain amount of eyes on the quality there. There's a certain amount of metrics that you're watching. The deployment strategies, again, if you're going to be deploying releases quarterly versus, let's say, weekly, it's a big difference, right? How much time are you spending during the deployment tasks themselves? And what roles do people assume from build to deploy to test to all of those different categories?
So in our scaled DevSecOps, at the beginning, we have support from leadership. And as we move up through governance, we have strong leadership.
Mm-hmm.
What's the characteristic of the definite or the change between those two elements
Right.
really over
So,
time?
so the reason I use the word support, and that was unconscious. It's great that you picked up on that. In pilot state, it's almost a change in mindset, right? So you could have strong leadership during pilot phase, but if the focus is to be completely operational, then you're never going to get that off the ground, right? Because DevOps, DevSecOps requires a complete change in mindset. In an operational company, in an operational world, especially within IT, the roles will be very clearly laid out. This is what you do. This is what a day looks like. And when issues pop up, here's the chain to follow to get an answer or get direction, right? In DevOps, DevSecOps, you can't always do that, especially when you're doing pilots. You will be forced to make certain decisions and live with them. You may be forced to explain why you made those decisions. You may be forced to change your own role, right? Developers may have to become a little bit more like QAs, right? Because the roles tend to shift left a little bit in DevOps. We already know that. Same thing with security, right? You can't just come in and say, here, go and do this, and bye bye. Let us know when you have that checklist, right? We talked about that from a security point of view. You need to be sort of working with the team and taking on those multiple hats. With strong leadership in governance, that's more about now building upon that supportive culture. Certain aspects of that hopefully have become a little bit more ingrained now. So then realizing where psychological safety is still needed, but then it's managing that top and bottom both, right? So going back to the C level and saying, or going back to the board for that matter and saying, look, here's the wins that we've seen, here's the gaps that we still need to address, and here's the original plan, by the way, that we had, but maybe we need to change certain aspects of that.
So are the leaders mandating governance then? Or are they just helping to enforce what has already been created from kind of the bottom up?
So that's a great question, right? And I've seen both those types of leaders. My personal style when I walk into these situations, and maybe it's just developed over time because I've been a consultant and you don't have a lot of authoritative power as a consultant, you're more of an influencer. So you really learn to bring people along in that way, right? In more like a matrix type organization. But in certain other organizations, you may actually have to change the formal role of a leader, to your point, to consider what would the organization actually need? What type of leadership style would you need? Because certain people may not be able to deliver on that, right? So that's where you may need to look around the table and say, what does my organization really need? What does the vision look like? Who are the people and the roles that are supportive of that? Because the leader in this case, long story short, would have to be a change agent, right? So lead by what's the term I'm looking for? Not pushing the people, but pulling the people
Right.
at the head of the game, as opposed to behind them, kind of telling them what to do, right? You would have to show them this is what we're looking for, and here's showing you by action, so to speak, right? So it would be both looking at what other organizations might be doing externally, but asking your people internally at all different levels what they need and mashing that together. There's no right or wrong answer.
Hmm. I have to think about that one. So
Yeah, I would love to hear your perspective as well, because that's governance is one of those things, quite frankly, Mark. Even if you look beyond DevSecOps, in digital transformation in general, there's many different types of leaders and organizations, especially today, right? I was
yes.
having this conversation in January, actually. If you look at the data, especially during COVID, there are 5 different generations we have in workplace right now, right? And then there's this budding, call it lack of equity or inequality that's happening because certain genders and certain people are exiting the workforce for various reasons during pandemic. So it's a perfect storm, if you will, right? And it's kind of the eye of the storm because vaccine conversations are happening right now, and at some point that would either get resolved or we'll continue to work the way that we are and it would get normalized. But at some point we would see the consequences of that. So the leadership that we have, especially on the journeys like DevSecOps in organizations, it would make a big difference on who you target as your customers, who your employees become in future, how you operate, how you deliver those services, and maybe even what those services are in future.
And you really have a much more collaborative mindset from a
Hmm.
DevOps perspective, an agile perspective.
You need
So
to, yeah.
you need the leader to advocate, but at the same time, it's almost leadership as a group, isn't it? Leadership by consensus, so that
Agreed.
the entire group is moving it's the definition of Scrum. The entire group is getting together to move
Yeah,
the project forward.
absolutely. And to be very honest with you, from a governance perspective, if I take a deeper look at it, there's multiple ways to do this. And in past, it's been very hierarchical approach, right? Things kind of go from bottom up, feedback comes down top to bottom. But what truly helps, going back to that agile practices type of mindset, when you're setting strategy for that, it really helps to think of it like an ecosystem, in my point of view, as opposed to a hierarchy, because most people will start setting their roles kind of like hierarchy, right? Here's the CDO or your new different roles, CTO, CIO. Here's like a director of DevOps or DevSecOps, and their job is to do X, Y, and Z. But that rarely works because you find that you can never formalize that. Things keep on changing, and there's a reason for that, right? As you go along your journey,
Yeah.
the way that you look at people versus roles, it really starts to move around quite a bit. So we talked about this earlier. Different people will need to take on different roles, and that's true of the leader as well, right?
It's that E-shaped versus T-shaped knowledge
Exactly.
perspective,
Yep, absolutely.
or even comb-shaped, I've heard.
Comb shape, that's the first time I'm hearing of that. I'll have to look that one up.
Right? You're
Yeah,
really good at a lot of different things, or
absolutely.
reasonably good at a lot of different things.
Yeah, but think about it, the comb itself comes from that hierarchy point of view as well. So I don't like that very much. Yeah. So then as we start to talk about scale, then you need to start looking at automation a lot more seriously. And we were just talking about the ecosystem. That's where the word autonomy comes into place as well, right? How much autonomy are you going to provide your leaders, your people, maybe even partners in that ecosystem, right? That are supporting your DevSecOps conversations. A lot of the times when you approach this level, ML ops is another term that gets thrown around these days. As your data mindset in the organization, I should say, is maturing, these conversations really start to collide a lot, right? So you could see that this part here will start to invite conversations from maybe what IKEA likes to call these days design ops, right? Design ops, ML ops. So different parts of organizations have taken on these different journeys, and they all start to sort of collide together when you have that conversation. So you're forced to think, okay, well, roles and responsibilities is one thing, but tools may be the other way to look at it. And now processes are colliding as well. So this is where, in my opinion, actually, what people can do or what companies can do is start to create a customer journey, which I've borrowed from the marketing folks, right? If you do everything with customer in mind, what will they see? What will their experience be? Then invariably you will scale it back. You will bring it back and say, okay, well, how would my internal processes need to look to enable that type of an experience, to enable that type of a service or ROI?
I'm looking at this and I'm thinking about your design ops, and I'm thinking about how do we get to conference ops, which are the discussions you had
Oh
when you
my
could go to a
goodness.
conference and talk around the edges, right?
Yeah. It's like everything ops, right? X ops, if you
But
throw that word in there.
I really like the scale, and I really like it because it seems to vary as a scale, right? That you have a little bit of it at one level and more of it at the other level. So even though you have all these great terms in there, that you really have autonomy even at the pilot level.
Mm,
It's just how much autonomy, right? How
agreed.
much can you be trusted
Yeah.
to move forward?
So it's one of those things, right? If you look at this culture of fail fast, fail often, when you support that as a leader, you're ultimately sowing the seeds for autonomy there. So that's why I don't like to use that word down here, because what happens is if you throw big terms around, other than agile, of course, everybody sort of understands what agile is. And again, that maybe put a star on even that statement. But if you use big words down here, all it does is sows a wrong seed in people's mind, because everybody would understand autonomy a little bit differently. They'll never sit down and talk about the definition of that word, but they'll get hung up on it and go and implement it differently. So I like to put those big words, like $100 words up here, because by then you've actually developed a definition in your own organization of what autonomy means to you, right? Or for those certain teams.
There's a Winston Churchill quote that says, "Don't look too far ahead. Only one link in the chain, only one link in the chain of destiny can be forged at a time."
That's
Right.
amazing.
So it's the same type of thing that you really need to keep the mindset small.
Right.
And even as we were talking with products and features and projects, is you've got to look at what you're doing today and how it
Right.
matters to the end of the sprint. If you're looking too far ahead,
Yeah.
you're
Yeah,
wrapping yourself up in your
especially
sale
the
problems.
problem is maybe I would challenge you a little bit on that actually. So you do need someone who's looking further ahead. But part of the challenge is you can't be the same person doing the work and looking further ahead. That would drive you crazy, right? Like imagine me having this conversation. What's the opportunity cost of this, and what else could I be doing? And like you would never get anything done that way,
Well, and I know that's why in some of them you get the product manager or to
right?
sit in the teams with you and tell you what's important, because they don't have to
Right.
do the work. All they have to do is tell you whether or not they like it,
Yeah.
how important it is.
Yeah,
So
that's why I love the definition of a scrum master, actually, right? Years ago, someone had sent me a chart, and number one thing was protect the team, right? That's what they do. That's what
yep.
it means to protect the team.
So I think we're getting close to the end of our time.
Yep.
I'll let you. Hey, is there anything else you want to wrap up with, or closing
Not really. I
thoughts,
mean,
takeaways?
the only thing I would point out is the importance of leadership, right? And we've talked it to death already, I feel like. But it's one of those things. If you don't have the right leader who's breaking down silos, right? That's the whole point of DevOps, DevSecOps. If you don't have the right leader that's influencing enough in this, especially the pilot and the alignment phase, who can actually deliver on that, then you would have a very tough time even talking about governance or scale. There's no point really. So that's one thing that's really important, breaking down silos.
Awesome. Well, Gunjan, thanks for the chat. I had a good time. I hope you had a good time. I hope our viewers
Absolutely.
had a good time when we're actually on it, and hopefully we'll both be in the chat to field other questions at that point.
Looking forward to it.
But looking forward to the DevOps Online Summit.
Absolutely. It should be very exciting, and I'm looking forward to all the other exciting conversations as well. Thank you so much, Mark.
Awesome. Have a great day.